Welcome back. On Sunday, what might become one of the most important meetings of the ANC's National Executive Committee is due to start to discuss the issue of whether the Secretary-General, Ace Magashule, must step aside. Magashule faces corruption charges in court. He has said he will not step aside and that he believes he has done nothing wrong. But at the same time, there is more evidence that the ANC is losing what you might call political authority, or even central political authority, over its own structures. Let me give you an example. This week, the Gauteng ANC Youth League told one of its members in the Gauteng legislature not to resign when the Premier asked him to do so. In places like Nkanga and Sol Plaatje and Tlokwe in the past, ANC councillors have ignored instructions from Luthuli House. So, can the ANC come back from the situation, or is some sort of decline inevitable? Professor Keith Gottschalk is a political scientist at the University of the Western Cape. Associate Professor Hanyane is from the Department of Public Management and Governance at Northwest University. And our senior politics reporter, Ziyanda Ngcobo, joins us now. I'm going to start with you, Ziyanda. Good afternoon to you. Firstly, how important is this meeting around Ace Magashule?
This meeting is very important, not just for Ace Magashule in particular, but I think for the structures of the ANC in totality. Remember that there's several senior ANC leaders that are facing corruption charges who've been asked to step aside, some who haven't stepped aside, like Bongani Bongo, for an example, others who have almost been forced to do so. And so whatever happens in this NEC meeting will set the tone then for other members within the ANC. And certainly, though, there is something to be said about the fact that the ANC has had to seek legal assistance for its own policy resolutions. So that also speaks to what you've been touching on the central authority and the political authority of Luthuli House to actually ensure, which is what the Secretary General's office is supposed to do, to ensure that conference resolutions are implemented. That's what the NGC is meant to do an assessment of that and also plan ahead for the 2022 elective conference.
Professor Gottschalk, we see evidence of what I would call the decline of the ANC's central political authority in the way that some of its deployees, some of its members simply ignore Luthuli House. So, for example, someone like Andile Lungisa or Mzwandile Messina, or even councillors in some of the municipalities. I mean, Tlokwe is a great example. Some of them just ignore instructions from Luthuli House. How are they able to get away with it?
Clearly, there's a slow crumbling of ANC authority over its elected office bearers, and that's got serious implications when this happens to a ruling party in any country. It also has another consequence. I remember over the decades many commentators saying that our proportional representation electoral system means that the elected MPs can ignore what the voters want because they are frightened of the power of the national ANC above them. And clearly, this shows that the MPs, MPLs and councillors no longer fear that authority of the ANC above them, whether it's proportional representation or not.
It's a fascinating thing to look at. I mean, that then, Professor Baloyi, brings us to the next question. If they're not scared of Luthuli House and they're not scared of voters, who are they scared of? And I would suggest that a starting point would be the constituencies that they represent. So Mzwandile Messina, for example, might feel he is more accountable to the Ekurhuleni region of the ANC than to Luthuli House. The same might apply to Andile Lungisa and Nelson Mandela Bay.
Yeah, Stephen, I think the main issue here is basically weaker branches that are purported to be the central base for support for the ANC. I haven't seen strong voices and indeed strong politicians emanating from branches directly and have a say when it comes to politics within the ANC. As much as that is the case, I think one of the greatest deficit in the ANC lies in its ethical compass. In this instance, we look at the role of the Integrity Committee that over the years has not been beefed up through proper systems and processes that are able to hold certain members into into account. And then, of course, there's the issue of consistency. As you rightly put it, in some places, there is a need to demand accountability, and in some places, people simply just ignore the voice from Luthuli House, as is the case in the broader Northwest and not necessarily in the former Tlokwe municipality.
I would suggest, Professor Baloyi, that one of the main reasons for that is that you don't have a unified NEC. I mean, Andile Lungisa was able to, I mean, he lied, frankly, on TV talking to us 2 days ago when he said he hadn't defied an NEC instruction, but he did, to resign from his position. He was able to get away with it because the NEC wasn't united.
No, absolutely. It reflects on the fragmentation of the ANC, but most importantly, no strong track record of holding those who seem to be on the wrong side of the ANC's constitutional prescripts to account. And this is the biggest problem that the party is facing. Overall, the failure to modernize and put in place, as I said earlier on, processes and systems that can make it much more stronger and be able to hold certain individuals accountable.
Professor Gottschalk, you've written extensively about what is happening in the branches and the branch mechanisms. Now, as we are on there now, I saw a report just in the last few minutes in Daily Maverick suggesting that the ANC now has 1.4 million members. That's the highest number it's ever had. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all the branches are actually working. In fact, your suggestion is that they're not.
The latest audited figures for the ANC's membership that I know of is that there's 600,000 paid up members, meaning in good standing, and the higher numbers would include members who's lapsed because they haven't renewed their payment, etc. Clearly, a major concern for the ANC, and no doubt other political parties, is that many branches have fizzled out since the last election. And for example, the Western Cape has not had a provincial executive for some years because there isn't a quorum of branches to elect a new provincial executive. And that's certainly warning signs for all those in Luthuli House to heed.
There is, I mean, a very strange situation, Professor Baloyi, that I think was first identified very neatly by I think it was the editor of the Sunday Times, where he said, you have all sorts of dynamics, but the ANC's main problem, if you get right down to it, and look, there are lots of main problems you could argue, and they're not immune, the DA has main problems too, but one of the main problems is that you will have delegates who will go to a conference, and they will pass a resolution that will say, you must not be corrupt, you must step aside if you're accused of corruption. And then those same delegates will elect someone who there is a general perception is corrupt. I mean, Ace Magashule is an example, the Deputy President David Mabuza is an example. People could easily say things about Cyril Ramaphosa and the fact that he was former President Jacob Zuma's deputy for so long. That to me seems to be a huge conundrum that no one can really get around.
Yes, Stephen, that is rightly the case. Unfortunately, the ANC has allowed a culture of clandestine relationships to sort of like persuade members to vote and put their votes around certain particular candidates. We cannot run away from the fact that the so-called brown envelope issue still haunts the ANC. The buying of votes is still there. There might be denial around this issue, but money has become the central sort of commodity for transactions when it involves the buying of votes. And unfortunately, this becomes a divisive factor in terms of influencing factionalism within the ANC. And of course, those who have the means are likely to occupy key strategic positions within the party.
Professor Hanyane, I do appreciate the time, so thank you very much indeed. Professor Gottschalk, I'm going to ask you to stay with us for a few more moments. I'm just going to turn to you, Ziyanda Ngcobo, in a moment, because what this points to is how important structure is. And if you occupy a position, as Ace Magashule does, of Secretary General, and you control a structure, you're actually in a very strong position.
You're in a very strong position, and the Secretary General's office, you're meant to embody the values, the principles, and the resolutions of the party. Now you have the Secretary General who's publicly said that he won't voluntarily step aside if you were charged with corruption during that exclusive interview that we did with him earlier this year. So what does that mean then when the Secretary General, the person who's meant to embody then these values, is the one who's defying conference resolutions? He's the one who's defying what he's meant to be doing in terms of his constitutional mandate within the ANC. So it becomes very difficult then for the party to navigate that. And I think the issue of a united NEC then becomes important to ensure then that that structure is in place, that even if you have a Secretary General such as Ace Magashule defying things, that you know that the highest decision-making body between conferences will make sure and they will intervene. That's why then this matter is actually sitting with the NEC. They're the only ones who are empowered actually to deal with the issue of the Secretary General, given his level of seniority.
A united NEC, we might have to wait for 2022 for that to happen. We're going to continue this conversation with Ziyanda Ngcobo, our senior political reporter, Professor Keith Gottschalk, and then also in a moment, Sanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. She's with us already. She'll be joining us in just a moment. This conversation around the lack of central political authority will continue. Stay with us.